wake. Baada ya kusema hayo, Professor Lumumba, please, I'm pleased to welcome you to the podium kuzungumza na sisi hapa. Asante sana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ningezungumza kwa Kiswahili lakini nataka nieleweke moja kwa moja kwa wale ambao hawaelewi Kiswahili. Kwa hivyo nitazungumza kwa lugha ya Kiingereza. Lakini nimenitanguliza kwa lugha ya Kiswahili ili ieleweke barabara ya kwamba naifahamu lugha ya Kiswahili. Ladies and gentlemen, I have done a paper. I'll not use it because I want to interact with you. I have only 10 minutes to do so. And I've been asked to speak about a very broad subject, achieving broad socio-economic gains deriving from the mining sector. I am aware that those who are present in this assembly are men and women who are familiar with the sector, perhaps much more than I. But the reason why I've been asked to speak is because my subject is not a technical one. And as I was thinking about this presentation, whose full flavor you will appreciate when you receive my paper, I had the occasion to reread two books. Perhaps the first one is not a book, is a presentation that was made in 1986 by Kenya's Professor Ali Mazrui, Africa, a Triple Heritage. And what Ali Mazrui did in that presentation was to look at the post-colonial Africa and the resources that she has. What Mazrui did was to look at different countries of Africa and to pose the question, what benefits have we derived from our extractive industry? And he prefaced his presentation by saying, and I repeat, that Africa consumes what she does not produce and produces what she does not consume. And I think that there is merit in that statement, particularly when we talk about mining. And I remember at one time somebody asking, what would happen to the diamonds produced in Namibia or Tanzania if they are not of the industrial kind, if the European fashionistas did not wear diamond rings? It may look like a question that has no merit, but he was speaking to the availability of the market. The second book that I looked at again was a book that was written in the year 2014 by Martin Meredith, The Fortunes of Africa, 5 years of wealth, greed, and plunder. And in that book he talks about the mineral resources of Africa. And the last book, which I reread, was a book written by Greg Mills, Geoffrey Hubbs, David Davis, and President Olusegun Obasanjo, Making Africa Work, in which book they dedicate a whole chapter 5 to mining and its state in the continent of Africa. The question that has been posed and which we want to answer this morning is, what are the broad socio-economic benefits that Africa can derive from mining? And there are many of them, but it is important in order to understand and to contextualize that by prefacing the submission with the reality as it is today. And what is the reality? The reality is that if you look at the 10 top mining companies in the world, there is not a single African country. The European Switzerland will be represented. The Australians will be represented. The Indians will be represented. The Americans will be represented. And the Chinese will be represented. What that means, therefore, is there is not a single serious African company that is engaged in mining. And that in itself sends the clear message that there is only a limited benefit that we can derive from mining, because these companies are in business, sometimes cutthroat business, where throats sometimes are literally cut. That is the environment in which we operate. And if you permitted me to go into the much broader extractive industry, and you even included oil and gas into the arrangement, and you asked yourselves what are the 10 top producing countries, or rather not the 10 top companies in that arena, once again Africa is not represented. In other words, we are engaging in an enterprise where Africa is at the mercy of companies that are not within the continent of Africa, are not homegrown. And that weakens us. And that has been the reality, ladies and gentlemen, in the last 50 years since many African countries regained their independence. And that answers the paradox that why is it that African countries have all these minerals, and yet, ironically, they are some of the poorest countries in the world? How, for example, if you permit me, that the Democratic Republic of Congo, through research, is said perhaps one of the richest resource countries on earth, conservatively estimated by some at 34 trillion United States dollars, and yet, ironically, it is one of the poorest countries in the world. Meanwhile, mining has been going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rare earth, diamonds, gold. How is it that in Niger and in the Sahelian region, Burkina Faso, we are producing uranium, and yet the GDPs of those countries and the per capita incomes are at the very lowest? How is it that in Namibia and Botswana and in Ghana, and one can mention many countries, the benefits that are derived from mining are very minimal, so that even when we celebrate what the good professor was saying here, we are celebrating it simply because we have grown by 1 inch, but we ought to have grown by 1 meter. In other words, we are celebrating baby steps. And I'm submitting to us that that is going to be the reality going forward. And you look at the continent of Africa today, and you look at the contribution of the mining sector in a number of countries. Permit me to go to history a little. We remember in the early days, in the 1960s, Zambia was famous for her copper. And we knew that copper was the mainstay of the Zambian economy. As a young student, I was aware of Mwadui near Shinyanga and the diamonds that were derived from there. I was aware of the gold that came from the Ashanti area in Ghana. I was aware of the diamond that came from Sierra Leone. I was aware of the gold and the diamond and indeed the uranium that came from South Africa. I was aware of the diamond that came from Botswana and in Namibia. I was aware of the uranium that came from Niger and in Nouakchott, next to Nouakchott in in Mauritania, but 50 years down the line, the companies that are involved in this mining in Europe and America and in Australia and lately in China have become multi-billion companies, and yet Africa remains at the foot of human gain in this area. These are the realities. The Tanzanians will remember not so long ago a company called Acacia. Thank God it is out. And what it did in this country for over 20 years. You'll remember that Acacia was omnipresent, and I'm using the word omnipresent very guardedly as a term of art, to describe her presence in Africa and her exploits in Africa and how it derived that. Many of you will remember companies such as Rio Tinto, which were active in Mozambique, Anglo-American, and many of them. You are in that industry and you know. The question is, has Africa benefited as it should have, economically and socially, because she has these minerals under her belly? Yes, it is true that the economy of Zambia was sustained by copper and that employment opportunities were provided. It is true that certain infrastructures were improved. It is true that quite a number of industries may have been aided through benefits derived from mining, whether it was in manufacturing. Yes, it is true that certain schools may have been built. Yet it is true that certain health facilities may have been built because of benefits derived from these. It is true that perhaps the quality of people's lives may have improved marginally because of the benefits derived from mining. But you will appreciate that these were in the very early days. And the question that one wants to ask, what did we get the wrong hand of the stick, or we got the right hand of the stick, if you allow me to twist that statement a little? Which then begs the question, which is what I've been asked to speak to for 15 minutes. It begs the question, when one looks at Africa today, what are the broad socio-economic benefits that can be derived from the mining sector? And permit me to exercise a little latitude to include the entire extractive sector and to look at oil also, because oil and gas. The truth be told, Africa has been shortchanged. And Africa will continue to be shortchanged, because if you look at the entire ecosystem in the mining arena, even when we talk about local legislation, you will discover that local legislation has a foreign flavor to it. Not that it should not, because even if Tanzania has our own laws and regulation, those laws must take on board the reality that if you mine gold and diamond or cobalt, you are going to trade in a global world. So there is a sense in which you cannot make law that is not sensitive to those realities. But there is also a reality that there is always the push, particularly by these companies which are external, which are designed to ensure that the investors always have the upper hand. Not to say that investors should not have their place, because they deploy a lot of resources. But how can we have a balance in which the countries where they mine and the environments where they mine also derive benefit? I'm suggesting to us that if Africa does not organize herself, she will always be shortchanged. How so? These multinational companies and their multinational countries have a lot of traction and have a lot of influence in their home governments, so that sometimes it's very difficult for countries to resist them. If you doubt, ask the Zimbabweans that you can be abandoned with your diamond, you can be abandoned with your cobalt, and your economy can be made to collapse if you operate as a single country, Zimbabwe. If you doubt, ask the Democratic Republic of Congo and the eastern part of it, how you can have a rare earth, which is the quintessential ingredient in all mobile telephones, and yet you derive no benefit from it. Ask Sierra Leone and Monrovia and Liberia how you can be hemmed in even with your minerals. I'm suggesting to us that indeed we can derive socio-economic benefit from the mining sector, but we will only do so if we are properly organized. And when I say organized, what do I mean? I mean, number one, that in the domestic arena, it is incumbent upon us to have pieces of legislation that are sensitive to the realities on the ground. We have already seen the statistics that have been displayed here on artisanal mining and the empowerment of your little miner, whether it is in Geita or Mirerani, and we have seen how that has helped improve the immediate lives, has improved the domestic environment in a manner that now informs the policy decision and direction of the Tanzanian government, which therefore tells us that if you are bold, then you can make changes which will inform and transform and revolutionize the benefits that are derived from mining. In the early days, you'll be victimized, and I am aware because I was keeping tabs on this. When Acacia was being asked to pay back tax by the Tanzanian government, the international community, not in their collectivity, but aspects of it, were telling Tanzania, you are now creating an environment that is hostile to investors. You are now creating an environment that does not allow investors to function. But it is still true that there is no gain without pain. History has demonstrated that not once, not twice, but times without number. But it is also incumbent upon Tanzania to know that you can only go so far in that direction. Going forward, there is wisdom and necessity to ensure that we now begin to negotiate and to deal with these companies from a regional perspective, so that if they run away from Tanzania, they do not find a different ecosystem in Kenya, which is different from Tanzania. They do not find a different ecosystem in Uganda or in Burundi or in Rwanda or in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The oxygen they breathe must be the same across the region. And I think that in my view, is what the East African Parliament should be doing. So that when we are issuing our protocols, we have a protocol that deals with mining. And when we deal with mining in the Great Lakes region in that regard, then we are sure that we are telling them this is what we are going to do when we talk about the social benefits that are going to be derived. When you are mining in a particular area in Geita, these are the things that we want you to do. We want to ensure that some of the profits are deployed to deal with health services. They are deployed to deal with education. They are deployed to deal with the environment, because environmental devastation comes with mining. They are deployed to ensure that we have opportunities. They are deployed to ensure that we have transfer of technology. Because for how long will Africa continue to be in diapers of technology as the rest of the world continues, so that in the next 10 years, when we talk about the leading mining companies in the world, we'll have at least 3 African mining companies which have now cut their teeth in the arena of technology. I believe that that is important. And when one talks about those regional approaches, one must now persuade SADC, and it is noted that Tanzania is a member of both the East African Community and SADC. You will know, for example, and there is a book that I've just cited written by Greg Mills and others, in which he gives the example of how the gold sector has suffered in South Africa, with the consequence that some of the big players like Anglo-American have migrated because there were certain stringent conditions that were introduced. Many of you will remember the debacle in Marikana mines in South Africa, and the continued the resurgence of the artisanal miner, particularly in rare metals or precious metals such as gold, is very important when you are talking about alluvial gold and diamond and all these things. You want to strengthen the person in rural Africa. And when you strengthen that person in rural Africa, then the mining sector becomes realistic and true, so that he is not bombarded with GDP. GDP and per capita income means nothing if you don't have money in your pocket. I was listening to the director of the African Development Bank, Dr. Kinumi Adeshina of Nigeria, and he said something that I agree with, that nobody eats the GDP. It is not edible. GDP is not edible at all. What people eat is money in their pocket. And these are the socio-economic benefits that we want to have in Africa. And when one talks about money in people's pocket, it means that we now have the ability to have disposable income. And when we have disposable income, it means that we begin to save. And when we begin to save, then we are growing our banking sector. And when we are growing our banking sector, it means that our monetary sector is also improving. And it means, therefore, that we are reducing hunger. And when we improve our nutritional level, then you can see the domino effect, that infant mortality will go down, maternal mortality will go down, and you will find that life expectancy goes up, and you will discover that the burden on our health sector is also reduced. And in that regard, you can see a myriad of socio-economic benefits that will come into play. I'm aware that I was only supposed to tease out these issues, therefore I'll draw to the end of my submission so that my other friend will contribute and cross-fertilize my thoughts. And how do I conclude? I conclude by saying that I am beginning to see things in Africa that tell me that Africa can actually derive benefit from the mining sector. We have spoken for too long. And when you move across Africa, you see every country has a vision. Tanzania has its own vision. Nigeria had a vision which was a 2020 vision. I was telling them the time has now run out. Now the last vision was a mirage. Now we have to have another vision. Kenya has a vision 2030. I think Rwanda has a vision 2036. And all of us have vision. But the beauty now is that Africa is beginning to recognize that we must have a continental vision. For those who are Afro-pessimists, they think that that is a bad thing. Africa Agenda 2063, broken down in its various components under the 7 pillars on which it stands, is telling us that we are going to be a middle-level economy across the continent, and that we are going to leverage on different sectors such as the mining sector. I can't agree more. And the mining sector will only make sense if there is value addition. It doesn't and has never made sense to me that the price of diamond is determined in Antwerp in Belgium, and they don't produce even a morsel of diamond. They don't. And yet they tell us this is the price of diamond. Somebody sitting in some air-conditioned office in Antwerp telling us that gold is produced in Ghana, Ashanti gold, and is traded in the London Stock Exchange. I've never understood that. Perhaps I'll be made to understand during this conference. And I'm saying that that can only happen in the context of a continental approach. And very lastly, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Those of you who are in this on a daily basis, and I know Ambassador Mwita and others whom I know, are on a daily basis. The Continental Free Trade Area begins to work in earnest in the month of July from its secretariat in Ghana. And what we are beginning to realize as Africa is that individually we are weak. And permit me, Mr. Chairman, even if I'm overstepping and overshooting, I came all the way from Kenya. I deserve some latitude. You imagine Sudan with a GDP of 2 billion United States dollars, negotiating with Anglo-American whose annual turnover, and these are not exact, I'm just saying, of 50 billion United States dollars, negotiating with Sudan about a mine where they'll deploy 5 billion and derive possibly 12 billion in 20 years. As Mwalimu Nyerere used to say, and permit me to give this analogy, even in boxing, the rules are the same, Mwalimu used to say. But you can't have a lightweight and a heavyweight in the same ring on the argument that the rules are the same. He used to say that if you have a lightweight and a heavyweight in the same ring on the same rules, then that is no longer boxing, that is murder. And I'm suggesting to us that going forward, therefore, we can only derive the benefits continentally, remove the tariff and non-tariff barriers, have common standardization, have common rules of engagement, have common rules of deployment. Then what we call broad socio-economic benefits will begin to emerge. And let me tell you, the benefits are monumental. Permit me to list them as the last item. Your health services will be improved because of the income that we derived. Your schools will improve. And I've already said your infrastructure will improve. And I've already said there will be employment, and not only employment, we will have innovation and invention. And we are now talking about the fourth industrial revolution. In order to participate meaningfully in the fourth industrial revolution, we need resources. So ladies and gentlemen, one can talk until the cows come home. But the cows will come home in the next 11 hours. I do not intend to speak for that long. My remit is simply, as I think I have, to isolate these issues and to say that holding all factors constant, we will not grow. But if we begin to think differently, if we begin to think without the box, not outside of it, then I think Africa can derive benefit from the mining sector. Yesterday, a friend of mine told me, whether it's true or not, I do not know, but even if it is not true, it makes my point, that the United Arab Emirates have a ministry called the Ministry of the Impossible. I think African governments need to have that ministry, where the role of the minister, Mr. Minister, perhaps they should add you that docket, where your only role is to think on a daily basis about the impossible and how it can be made possible. Thank you very much.
When I welcomed Professor Lumumba to speak here, I was very nervous because it is very difficult to manage him when he speaks. But believe me, he has spoken 3 minutes before time. And I'm not going to attempt to summarize what he was saying, only to say that there is this very good suggestion that was given at the last of his minutes, that we need to advise our president to add to the Minister of Minerals, Minister of Minerals and Impossible. Otherwise, I think he has raised important issues in his presentation at a very global level, but the first very big question that I see, and I know Professor Mkutano Yongera Kidogo, is the place of Africa in the global mining business industry. I think this is clear. Despite being the producers of many minerals, our place seems to be still very shaky. I think that is an important issue that we need to observe. And of course, he was mindful of the steps that we are making, but very cautiously saying that we don't have to be complacent, because the steps we are making, they're important and useful, but they're really still very small steps. And for us in psychology, we say it is important to acknowledge the steps we are making, because they become source of